Welcome to the Center Collaborative, Creative Solutions in Behavioral Health and Criminal Justice, brought to you by the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, which is also known as the Center. We at the Center are all about solutions. Our job in Oregon is to facilitate improvement of the system so behavioral health and criminal justice can work better together to engage people in treatment while promoting public safety. I am your host, Chris Thomas. I hold a master's degree in clinical psychology and have focused on the intersection between behavioral health and criminal justice for 20 years. Over 7 of those years were behind the walls of a maximum security prison. During this podcast, you will have the opportunity to sit in on real, in-depth conversations with experts about complex topics in a way that is both fascinating and digestible. We will focus not just on what is wrong with the system, but what is going right and how we can work together to evolve. This podcast is a conversation in a series of conversations where we touch on people's legal rights and their options related to seeking medical care. Since our conversations are intended for informational and educational purposes only, they are not a substitute for or a reason to delay seeking professional legal or medical advice. On today's episode, I am joined by Ed Jones, retired judge and, at the time of the recording of this podcast, Interim Executive Director of Oregon Public Defense Services, OPDS. I've known Judge Jones for a number of years, and I reflexively call him Judge Jones, so you'll hear me refer to him as that throughout the podcast. Judge Jones and I talk about what OPDS does. We discuss the long-term consequences of felonies and misdemeanors and how misdemeanors can snowball into more serious consequences. We talk about collectively asking ourselves, is the criminal justice process the right approach for this problem? Is this a public health issue? We acknowledge that just sending someone to jail doesn't necessarily address the roots of the behavior resulting in them going to jail. We talk about what we can do differently. We also discuss disparities in treatment within the system and how important thoughtful analysis is regarding enforcement and behavior change versus relying on habitual behavior. I learned so much during my conversation with Judge Jones. I think you will too. Welcome to our conversation. Judge Jones, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad to have you with us today.
Thanks, Chris. I'm looking forward to this chance to talk with you about misdemeanor cases. And just to provide a little background, I'm here as the interim head of the Office of Public Defense Services. We're the people who provide the public defenders and psychologists and polygraphers and investigators that the defense uses in its defense of all the criminal cases that are issued in the state of Oregon. And so the state spends a couple $100 million a year on that. And it's our job to figure out who's going to do the cases and how we're going to pay them. And I came to this job because they're doing a national search for a new director and asked me, a retired judge, to step in while they're doing that search. And the reason they asked me is because I've been a lawyer since 1975. I spent many years as a criminal defense lawyer, and then many years as the director of a public defender office, and then many years as a circuit court judge, ending with a couple of years as the chief criminal judge in Multnomah County. And then I retired. And now I've been pulled out of retirement to spend 6 to 9 months in this office working with the people here about making sure that everybody who has a right to a lawyer gets a competent lawyer.
And that's not all that OPDS does. OPDS also helps pay for aid and assist evaluations when the defense asks for them as well. Is that right?
Yes. It turns out that what we do, the larger part of it, is representing people who've been charged with crimes. But we also represent both children and parents in dependency cases or terminations of parental rights. Lawyers we pay for there for the kids and for the parents. And if a defendant in any one of these cases has mental health, behavioral challenges, then the lawyer is interested in having a psychological examination. And sometimes it turns out people are simply not in a place where they can cope with the idea that they're a criminal defendant. And the law doesn't allow us to prosecute people who are in that state. And so instead of prosecuting them, we delay the prosecution and we make an effort to bring that person to competence about what it means to be a criminal defendant, what choices they have in their case. And of course, that can be very challenging when you're a lawyer assigned to someone who's not able to exercise their own judgment about what's a good idea and what's a bad idea. And so those in some ways are the most difficult cases that lawyers have to contend with. Usually you have a client who has goals or interests or concerns and you respond to those however the law allows. But when the client is not in a position to make choices, it becomes much more difficult. And we evaluate those people for whether they're competent to participate in the case. And in some cases, they end up going to the Oregon State Hospital for competency restoration. It's tempting to think of it as treatment, but it really isn't treatment. They're not trying to address their underlying problems. They're simply trying to get them to the point where they can talk with their lawyer about the choices they have and make an intelligent, informed decision about their future.
And that was how you and I ended up working together initially when I was at the health authority and working on the aid and assist issue in Oregon. And you were the judge in Multnomah County that took all the aid and assist folks in one docket. So you could look at who went to the state hospital and who went to community restoration. And as I recall, I think you were one of the very first judges that did that in Oregon.
It was desperately needed. Multnomah County, of course, the largest county, we were sent close to 100 people a year to the state hospital, and half of them were on misdemeanors. And so people would be sent to the state hospital. They might spend anywhere from a few days to a few months there at no small expense. And then they would come back either restored, i.e., capable of dealing with their case, or unrestored. And generally, if they were unrestored, the case would simply be dismissed. Sometimes they would be referred for a commitment hearing, a different procedure for which we also provide the lawyers. And for those who were now competent, we would resolve their case. The problem with that whole process is that in resolving those cases, we rarely did much to help that client have a better future. We did get their case resolved, but having done 2 days in jail or a year worth of probation where they never saw a probation officer, none of those consequences really moved the needle in terms of helping the people that came into the case from not having it happen again. And indeed, many of the people we dealt with, we saw over and over again because their untreated mental illness simply consistently got in the way of their being able to conform their behavior to the expectations of the community. You're out screaming and throwing things in the street or assaulting a neighbor or whatever it might be. And people are legitimately upset. And so the officer comes and you're back in custody and the whole thing starts over again.
Your examples made me think of when I chat with people about the difference between felonies and misdemeanors, there's a lot of confusion around that. I think that a lot of folks think felony, bad, scary, dangerous, and misdemeanor, no big deal. But that isn't necessarily the case. Someone can, as you pointed out in your example, assault someone and still have a misdemeanor, or depending on how much damage someone does, they can have a felony when it's something like the difference between breaking your parents' TV and breaking all the TVs and video only is the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony in the middle of a symptomatic episode. So, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. In ancient times, back in Old England, from whom we inherited our criminal justice system, there were a very limited number of felonies, a half a dozen. Burglary, breaking into somebody's home at night to steal something, assault, murder, just a very small number of them. And today, there are thousands of felonies. And of course, so when people say that felonies are more important, it's true for the most serious ones: rape, robbery, murder, assault with injuries. These are serious crimes. And in Oregon, most of them are gathered under Measure 11 these days. And that guides how those cases are processed. And they carry allegedly mandatory prison sentences with them. But there are also many felonies taking more than $1,000 worth of televisions, which is not hard to do, and so on and so forth. Felony driving while suspended would be another one. So there are many felonies that are not particularly serious in the sense of personal losses or injuries, but they do carry, every felony, lots of consequences, even if you don't get sent to prison, because not everyone convicted of a felony goes to prison. The majority of them don't. They get probation, but they also get that felony conviction. And that has all sorts of implications for their future, whether it's getting housing, getting employment. You can't be a barber with a felony conviction, or a hairdresser. And one can believe that at the time those rules were made, people might have genuinely been concerned about the idea of felons cutting hair. But it turns out that it isn't that relevant to your ability to give a good haircut. And we need to address those issues. Misdemeanors, which are generally seen as much less serious, that's not always true. And the two that come up the most often are drunk driving, which of course can be extremely dangerous for others driving around near the drunk driver, or for the passengers of the drunk driver, and then domestic assaults. And so those are the two misdemeanors that, even though they're not felonies, they're very serious matters, public safety matters in those kinds of cases, and they get treated quite differently from most other misdemeanors. Shoplifting, criminal mischief, harassment, which is an assault where there is no injury. If I push you around a little, you're not injured, you haven't been assaulted, you've been harassed. And that's a crime by itself, obviously not as serious as injuring you. But those crimes, even though they're technically not serious and technically don't necessarily result in any inability to get a job or do anything else, they can have a really significant impact on an individual's life. Even 2 or 3 days in jail can be transformative. Many of us have jobs where if we didn't show up for 3 days, we still wouldn't lose the job. But that's not the case for a lot of people. If you're working in a minimum wage job, if you're not there, and particularly if you're not there because you're in jail, you don't have a job. And if you're there for very much longer, you may not have a place to live either. And if you're someone who lives on Social Security, as many do, after 30 days in jail, they're going to cut off your Social Security. So the implications of picking up a misdemeanor conviction can be fairly significant. And even if you don't lose your job, you're going to have to go to court. And it isn't night court. Almost essentially every court appearance happens during the work day, which is fine if you don't have a job. And maybe you don't after you got arrested. But if you're trying to keep a job, you have to go to your boss and say, I got to be in court at 2 o'clock tomorrow, and so on and so forth. And some employers are much more patient about that than others. So even a relatively minor misdemeanor can be a problem to get through. And that's just getting it done, because if the judge wants you to be on probation, you may have things you have to do, programs to go to, community service to do, and so forth. And so the demands get put on you. And if you can't live up to them, then warrants are issued and you're back in custody. And what we see happen is it snowballs. For example, you get a speeding ticket and you don't manage to get into court. And so the judge in your court fines you whatever the standard fine is, and he suspends your driver's license because you didn't show up. And then you're driving around and now you're suspended. And so you get stopped by the police, and this time you don't get a speeding ticket, you get a misdemeanor driving while suspended ticket. And now all of a sudden there's a possibility of jail because this is a misdemeanor. And we wouldn't expect you to get jail on a first driving while suspended, but it starts to add up. And all of a sudden, you're in a hole that you can't climb out of. You owe too much money. You have too many court appearances behind you. You're too familiar to the arresting officers and the booking people and the judges. And things start to go downhill. And this question of, is what we do to the people we catch actually improving their lives and the community's life by how we process those cases? We would like to think that if you get, let's say, a criminal mischief and you go to court and the judge says you're guilty and you need to do 24 hours of community service, and you do it, that you might have learned something from that experience, that maybe you won't do it again the next time. But the reality is that's not how it works. Crimes aren't really deliberate acts in the way we usually think of, oh, I've decided to read that book or go to that movie or marry this person. Maybe scratch that last one. But mostly people make decisions in a kind of thoughtful way. But that's not how people go about committing crimes. Crimes happen. Often they're as much a surprise to the person committing them as they are to everybody else in the room. And there you are. And how you can help people not get themselves into those situations is the challenge. What can I say for you or do to you? How can I help you avoid situations that are going to lead to your arrest? And that's not a trivial question because it requires an awareness of who you are and where you are that helps you stay out of trouble. And I'd like to say that everybody has that, but it's pretty clear that not everybody has that. And we all have moments where we don't have it. And if the question is, could you get stirred up enough to do something stupid? The answer for almost all of us is yes, you could. And if it's a one-time event, fine. But people fall into patterns of this, and then we need to help those people break out of those patterns. And a couple days in jail or a class about something rarely gets that done. It takes a deeper look into people about how they got to be where they are, a chance to rethink it. You know, when penitentiaries were invented, And keep in mind that in ancient, not some hundreds of years ago, punishment was always of the body, right? We'll whip you, we'll chop something off. There's none of this long term response to crime. There was something immediate that was done about it. In modern times, we've come to see, well, we need to change this person's thinking, change this person's behavior. And so penitentiaries were invented so you could do penance, right?
Yep.
You could get right with God by being in your cell, almost like a monk, with the Bible, and over a period of time of reflection, that you might come to better understanding of how to stay out of trouble.
And unfortunately, that isn't usually how people change their behavior anyway. Being in a cell by yourself with a Bible to think about what you've done wrong generally is not the way that behavior change occurs. And for folks who are coping with significant behavioral health concerns, it can make it even worse. Or for folks that are on the cusp of it, it can trigger an episode by all that time by yourself in a cell all alone, supposedly thinking about how to be a better person. But generally, that's not how that turns out.
Yeah. And of course, unsurprisingly, these situations where somebody transgresses, shows a lack of respect for another person or their property, are much more common when you have people who are having a hard time conforming their behavior to the normal standards. They get sideways with their neighbors, their friends, their everybody. And then we step in as the criminal justice system, but we really don't have the tools to help those people. And the notion, well, for example, cigarette smoking vastly reduced in this country, but not because we made it a crime. We could have, but it would have been an extremely different approach than having TV ads about people with little holes in their throat and all the sort of social pressure that has come around smoking and by prohibiting smoking in buildings, direct ways of changing people's behavior. And there's a lot of evidence that they're more effective and certainly cheaper than trying to use the criminal justice system to change people's behavior. So, as we look at each problem behavior, you have to ask, what's the right tool? Is this a public relations campaign? Is it a medical issue? Is it a criminal law issue? What's the best approach to that particular set of undesired behaviors?
It makes me think of, I don't remember who I was talking to, but they were talking about the criminal code and how it has increased over the years.
Yes, it's always tempting to create a new crime. And there's always a kind of dynamic where you say, well, if we've got a crime, making it a crime to, let's say, hit a policeman, a different crime, more serious than just hitting some person. Then the next discussion is, well, shouldn't firemen get that too? Or daycare workers or whatever. And so there's a tendency for crimes to just metastasize and to start to spread. And so we end up with more and more of them. But there's a limited amount of enforcement, how many policemen are out there looking for these crimes, and limited resources for prosecuting them in the district attorney's offices and in the courts. So we often essentially waste resources using the criminal law on problems that it's not well suited to working with. The criminal law assumes that everybody's rational, and if we show them that there are negative consequences attached to a particular behavior, like stealing from stores, that they'll stop. But it turns out that kind of thinking doesn't really deal with children. It doesn't deal with addicted people, and it doesn't deal with people with mental health behavioral challenges. Three groups that have a hard time with that simple logic of, hey, negative consequences, therefore I'm going to stop doing it. In those three groups, that equation really doesn't move them to be different. And it's unsurprising with the kids. It's a little more surprising with addicted people. And when you get to people with mental health, behavioral challenges, it's the least surprising of all, I suppose, in the sense that why would we think that Bob here, who has a long history of mental illness and disruptions of his neighbors' lives, it didn't work, right? We have not convinced him in some rational way to stop those behaviors. And frankly, we're never going to get to that answer with that approach. Someone has to sit down with Bob and spend the time with him and teach him where the behavioral limits are. And over time, people do figure these things out with help. And particularly if we stabilize their living situation, you can achieve a lot for people, make them much less of a problem for their friends and family and neighbors because they have a stable situation and some help thinking through these problems. But without that help, it's essentially hopeless. They just keep cycling back into the system. When people come into the criminal justice system because they've been arrested, generally what they're charged with is only one and not necessarily the largest of their problems. They bring a lot of problems with them to the case. And just solving the case, well, there you go. You did your 2 days in jail, it's over. We have addressed zero of the problems that got us there in the first place. And so, why are we surprised when we see Bob again? We shouldn't be. We didn't deal with the real problem. And defense lawyers and prosecutors and judges will often see that, but they don't have the tools to address that because the system is very constrained and very punishment oriented, when in fact, anybody who's raised a kid or trained a dog knows that punishment has a place in those processes, but it's much smaller than most people believe, and it has to be used in the most sparing of manners to be effective. And the urge to punish. And I've always thought that when people think about this stuff, they have a tendency to go back to their own childhood and think about how they were treated when they misbehaved. And you will hear people say, I wasn't beaten enough. And if only my father had been stricter with me, it would have turned out better. I would say to those people, that's not true. But it's hard to tell people that what they suffered through was to no purpose. We all have a tendency to look at whatever suffering we've gone through as being an important part of who we are. And that's true, but it's not necessarily a good part of who we are. But to say to people, all those times your father tried to beat some sense into you were wasted. It's hard for people to hear that. It's hard for dad to hear that because you hear parents say, I didn't like it, but I had to do it. This hurts me more than it hurts you. And that's not true, but it does hurt both of them. There's no doubt about that. That imposing those kinds of punishments and receiving those kinds of punishments, whether it's from your parent or from a judge, does not move things forward. And it's hard to accept that punishment really isn't the best tool in the vast majority of situations. We're all designed around punishment. And that needs to change. But it's going to be a very difficult process to get people to the place where they say, this person is misbehaving. How can we help them? As distinct from how can we punish them?
How do you see that moving in that direction of what will help more in changing behavior? I know that we've started seeing more treatment courts over the years, particularly behavioral health courts, if it gets to a point where someone does need to be in the system. What other ways, though, do you see that it's more helpful than if they don't show up, then we do a warrant for failure to appear, and then they don't appear because they're disorganized, and so you do more warrants with more fines. People are never going to pay, especially when we're talking about folks with significant issues around cognition and organization, sending someone to jail. What can we do differently?
There's two parts of that. The treatment courts are one, a way of actually saying, look, we're going to defer the punishment piece of this and actually participate with you in a program to change your behavior. A lot of drug courts are organized in that fashion. And then we have mental health courts. In many ways, a more challenging process because there isn't any clean and sober version of mental health, so that it's not this alleged goal that you can define as, hey, if he hasn't used any drugs in 60 days, we're good. You have to take a different approach. The other thing that we're doing is, first, in cases involving families, juveniles, and ultimately, I think in all cases, we're adding social workers into the criminal defense toolkit. So that if I'm appointed to represent you, I have a social worker that I'm connected with that can help me understand why it is you have these problems and what the best approach to changing your behavior might be. This is not something lawyers are trained to do or judges are trained to do. It's a very subtle art, but a lot is known about how to cause these changes, and we don't make use of the people who have that knowledge in the way that we should. And one of the campaigns we're on here at OPDS, the Office of Public Defense Services, is to plug social workers into these caseloads so that if you're representing parents who are at risk of losing their children, for example, you have a social worker who can help you understand why these parents are having those problems and why the kids need whatever help they need. And that'll clearly move things in the right direction because the answer is more, where can we get to, than what's the right punishment. It's just a different question, and it's a question that has a lot better answers for the long-term health of the community.
Right. Instead of immediate punishment here and now that doesn't really change the behavior, addressing the root causes of the behavior, which takes longer and is more complicated and maybe to some less satisfying, increases the probability that you're less likely to see that person in your court again.
Right. And the other place that the social workers are really valuable is before the case even starts. And in the sense that it's not difficult. You could go down to the Portland police and they could identify the 100 people in the Portland area who've been arrested 10 times in the last year. And if we took that list of people, they would turn out to be maybe not overwhelmingly, but the majority of them would be people with behavioral health issues. And since we already know who they are, there's no reason we can't have social workers out there working with them now before they get arrested. And various programs have been put in place like that. Portland has had a long series of different visual models of that kind of behavior where we're trying to get out in front before the arrest, identify the people who are likely to get arrested, and help them avoid it. And that has an additional payoff in that the same people who are getting arrested all the time are also heavy users of other social services. They show up at the emergency rooms. They show up at the clinics. They're constantly looking for help, and legitimately so. They constantly need help. But if we can get somebody working with them before it gets out of control, they can manage their use of these other resources much more effectively. The 10th time the guy says, I need an ambulance because I'm having a heart attack. And once again, he's not really having a heart attack. But how do you deal with that? And the answer is rather than spending $1 million a year carting one guy around repeatedly, which has happened, we work with him to understand what his medical issues are and what that cry for help of I'm having a heart attack means and how it can be addressed without an ambulance. And there's no question that this works. It's been demonstrated in many cities on many occasions that having those social workers out there in the field targeting the people we know are going to be bluntly a burden on the system, that we can get ahead of the curve and get those people the services without the drama and without the costs associated with doing all of that through the criminal justice system. And if there were one thing that I was going to push really hard in the larger sense, it would be precisely that. We have a lot of people who bluntly, except for them getting arrested, there wouldn't be a lot of concern about them. So we've got to change our attitude about those people, and getting them the help they need will save us the time and money, and that will allow us to focus on that much smaller group of people for whom the criminal justice system can be an effective tool. A different group of people, it turns out, than these behaviorally challenged people. Thankfully, because of Measure 110, we're going to pull out of the criminal justice system. At least in theory, it will be interesting to watch how this develops over time. We're going to pull those people out of the criminal justice system and address their problems in a different medical context. It can't be any worse than what we're doing now, and it shows every evidence of being significantly better in terms of the outcomes we can achieve. You have to sit down with people, actually think about where they are, what they need, and provide that if you're going to avoid future problems. It's just a question of commitment and foresight, which we haven't quite pulled ourselves together to do as a system so far.
It makes me think too, Judge Jones, when we're working with folks and there's the piece of getting caught in the misdemeanor system and all the consequences immediately that go along with that. But I think what folks don't realize around misdemeanors is that they do have long-term consequences for folks. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, most of the consequences are targeted at felonies, but that's not the case that they don't exist for misdemeanors. They do. And if you're introduced to your daughter's new boyfriend and he has multiple misdemeanor convictions, what's your reaction to that, right? You're like, hey. And of course, the employers have the same attitude and the landlords have the same attitude. And so these records, even if they don't technically bar you from things, do have an effect on how you're perceived and what opportunities you're given. And of course, not all people who commit misdemeanors get charged with misdemeanors. And in fact, the fairness of who gets charged is a very interesting discussion. If, for example, equal numbers of whites and blacks commit a particular crime, and for most crimes that's the case, or equal shares, but all the people who get arrested are black, there's an obvious unfairness in that we have no enforcement against certain communities for certain crimes and active enforcement against other communities for the same crime. And so that builds this disparate treatment. And when we look at what inhibits non-white people from success in this country, One of those factors is this contact with the criminal justice system, which disproportionately falls on those groups and then disproportionately reduces their chance of having a good job, owning a house, and so on and so forth. And so it just propagates through the system. And so the first injustice just starts that snowball effect we mentioned before. And in the end, you're in a hole and it's difficult to climb out of it.
I'm glad that you brought that up. The differences in the enforcement rates in different communities, and that you do see significantly more arrests in certain communities in a city than others, and then the long term consequences of that over time. That makes me think of data. And speaking of that, you have a project that we're helping you out with around misdemeanors and the tracking of misdemeanors around Oregon. It's a pretty fascinating project that I'm really excited about being a part of. And when I saw you a couple years ago at the Mental Health and Law Conference, you told me what you were working on. And I said, well, gosh, we have some data analysts. We can help you out with that. So you want to talk about that project?
What we're trying to do is actually create a picture of what misdemeanor prosecutions in Oregon look like. And most of them happen in the state court system, and pretty good records are kept. I can tell you how many drunk drivings in each county and how many theft twos and so on. But it turns out that the state courts are not the only place where misdemeanors are prosecuted. We have municipal courts and justice courts in Oregon, and it varies dramatically from county to county, but in some counties, a significant percentage of the cases are done in the municipal courts or the justice courts, and no statistics are kept about those. So when one asks how many people were arrested in Lane County for this or that, the answer is we don't know because no one collects all of the data from all of the courts. And of course, one wonders whether the same crimes are being prosecuted in, let's say, Tillamook Municipal Court as are being prosecuted in Hood River Municipal Court. How different are those courts? Different communities can have different approaches to criminal justice. We don't see a lot of cattle rustling in Multnomah County, but on the other hand, there are counties where it's a much bigger issue, and that's entirely reasonable. So that the fact that there are differences isn't all that exciting. But when you look at the same crimes, like what's the percentage of thefts that are being done, or how often are drunk drives being done, and so on and so forth, the theory is that we would begin to see differences between communities that would be revealing of how the decision makers decided to use the criminal law as a tool for justice and community safety in their jurisdiction. What is surprising to me is that there isn't as much variation from court to court as I might have guessed there would be. And really, as I've looked at the data, I've gotten the impression that most of what happens is a matter of habit rather than judgment. In other words, the police are looking for the same things and they find them, and the DAs are prosecuting the same things and they do. And it really isn't a response to community needs or community attitudes about the criminal justice system. It's just the habitual behavior of the people participating in the system. And what a thoughtful system would look might be very different. For example, if a city said, okay, we've got a problem with criminal mischief, people lighting the trash bins on fire or whatever it might be, is the criminal law the right tool? And different communities might come to different conclusions if they thought about it. But I don't see a lot of thoughtful analysis going on in terms of how many drunk drivers do you have to arrest to reduce the amount of risk to non-drunk drivers. Obviously, we could arrest one a year and make a big deal of prosecuting that person, but that probably wouldn't change anybody else's behavior. Or we could arrest 5,000 of them, or we could arrest 2,000 of them. How would you decide what's the right number? Now, it's just how many the police run across in the course of the average day. And that's not really the best approach, in my view, to thinking about how enforcement should work. We need a more thoughtful analysis of where is it that police intervention can change things. And for each crime in each community, you almost have to do a separate analysis and say, okay, how are we going to address shoplifting in this town? And shoplifting in Eugene, where you've got 30,000 college students, may look very different than shoplifting in some other city. What is your approach there? But mostly, we walk in ruts that are so deep we can't see out of them. It doesn't occur to people that it could be done any differently. And that's what needs to change. They used to talk about zero-based budgeting, where you rethink everything every year. It wasn't that great an idea, it turned out. But this notion of getting back and really looking at the system all the way down does make sense. And in misdemeanors particularly, we spend a lot of money arresting people and processing people. And if there are cheaper and more effective ways to reduce that kind of bad behavior, we should be all over them. And yet we find ourselves stuck in these habitual patterns of behavior.
The habitual patterns of behavior. Yeah.
One of the issues about drug treatment has always been, do you focus on first-time offenders or do you focus on the hardcore addicted people? And of course, if you're looking at first offenders, some percentage of them are going to turn into those hardcore addicted people. The percentage is not gigantic, however. And so if we got 100 guys on their first drug case, and we know that 5 of them are going to turn into serious criminal drug addicts. We don't know which ones, but statistically know that about 5 of them are going to head in that direction. We can treat the whole 100 and hope we do something for those 5. But that's a very inefficient process. And there's some evidence that treating the other 95 may make them worse. Asking you to come down to a building downtown and sit around with hardcore addicted people twice a week may not be the best thing for your personal future. Because if we're running a dating service and a drug market, then, we're not going in the right direction. On the other hand, if we go to the already clearly down into addiction and criminal behavior, at least we know we're not wasting our money. On the other hand, we've written off all those first-time people who, in theory, we might have done something for. And so if you have limited resources, do you spend them treating everybody and hoping you catch the ones that are going to be a problem in the future? Or do you wait until they sort out and then attack the ones that are clearly going to have problems? And if you have limited resources, you're forced into number 2. And personally, I think we have a tendency to focus on the first-time guys because it's a good story. It's heartwarming.
Yeah.
He tried heroin a few times and he got arrested. Now he's getting his life together. And we have a graduation where his mother comes and tears are shed and it's all great. Fine. But the reality is the vast majority of those 100 guys didn't need treatment. And he would have reunited with his mother anyway. And so all the resources we spent on treating him might have speeded it up a year or 2, maybe. But in reality, we weren't helping ourselves. We were treating people who didn't need treatment. But still, it feels very cold to just say you haven't done enough crimes to deserve treatment.
It makes me think, though, of the criminal justice system doesn't have to be the answer for everything, right? So
No.
maybe those 100 folks, maybe we look at other possibilities for treatment and engagement, and then we focus our resources on the folks where that didn't work. So
Yeah.
then they're continuing to engage in criminal behavior. We're seeing high risk that someone's going to commit another crime. We're seeing high treatment rate. Well, okay, then that makes sense for the criminal
Right.
justice system to be involved in those guys. It almost seems like because we've made the criminal justice system the answer to everything, that
Yes.
now we don't have enough resources for everything. And for those folks, those 100 people, putting them with the folks that have a high risk to recidivate and are really invested in their criminal behavior, we may increase
Yeah.
those folks that weren't going to probably commit another crime because they've been hanging out with a bunch of folks who have
Right.
high criminogenic thinking.
As my mentor, Judge Michael Marcus, said, risk is contagious.
Mm-hmm.
And that if some probation offices, some forward thinking probation offices around the country actually have different doors to their buildings
Really?
for the low risk and the high risk people.
Oh, how
They
interesting.
don't let them mix. And that's probably a good approach to dealing with that problem. Now, here in Oregon, since we voted 110, this in theory is a dramatic change. And what's going to happen is when the police officer finds you shooting up behind the dumpster, they're going to give you a ticket, not for a crime. It just says you have to go get evaluated for drug treatment. And then you have to come to court and tell them that you did it. And that's it. And in fact, you can get by without coming to court if the evaluator sends something to the court saying you came in, you got evaluated. And I know people react to that and say, doesn't he have to go to treatment? The answer is no. He has to get the evaluation. And maybe he has to get the evaluation every month, right? Now, a couple of things happen there, though. As people get those tickets, if they're in treatment, those tickets become relapse notices. In other words, I'm going to Bob's drug treatment and I come every week, and then all of a sudden I get that ticket. That ticket should come to the treatment program that says, look, Bob may be telling you he's clean and sober, but we found him behind the dumpster. That's a treatment issue, needs to be addressed in treatment. It's not a criminal law issue. And if the next step is if someone gets repeated citations for drug use and does their evaluations but never goes to treatment, and we're going to see a lot of that, we need to go out looking for that guy. In other words, the social worker needs to say, this is the 5th time you've been cited for out behind the dumpster shooting heroin. We need to address this. It's not the criminal justice system that's going to get that done. An intervention from the social service treatment perspective is the way to go. And you lean on people that way. Everyone's job in the criminal justice system has been redefined. It isn't about the drugs anymore. But that's going to be a heavy lift for many people in law enforcement, in probation, in the defender offices, certainly among the judges. About no, it doesn't matter. So he's a drug addict. It's not a criminal justice issue. If he's stealing stuff, that's different. Let's talk about that. But if he's just using drugs, it's like, whatever. Just stay out of everybody else's property and we're fine. But we do need to put pressure on those people to get into treatment, but it can't be from the criminal justice system.
For folks that don't have complex cases with what's going on with them, going to your doctor, taking your medication, all the things that in the traditional system. But those generally are the folks that we see in the criminal justice system. Generally, we see folks who've got behavioral health concerns, and substance use concerns and houseless and
Yeah.
physical issues, so many things. And I'm wondering, as either in your time as a judge or your time as a defense attorney, going through the traditional court system with someone with so many complexities, and at least the old school way of doing things with the court system is you did the court system. You went for competency and you went to trial. But being the defense lawyer and seeing all of or the judge and seeing all of this complexity of what was going on with a person and knowing that the traditional system wasn't going to do anything about that. We were just going to give them probation or send them to jail or
Yeah.
send them to prison. Do you have stories around that, thoughts about that?
As a lawyer, I'm talking to the guy, and it's clear he needs, let's just say in general terms, social services of some kind. But I know that the judge is going to impose a sentence, whether it's probation or prison, and that those social services aren't going to be a part of that package. They may be mentioned, but the reality of it is they're not really going to be delivered. If people come into probation and they're motivated and looking for treatment and willing to go, there's not a lot of probating to do. Hey, here's the address, go deal with it. And there are people like that, who say, oh my God, where have I gotten myself into? I need to get my act together. I need to deal with it. But they're not the repeat customers. They're the people that are one and done and say, hey, that was great. That was a success. But as far as the people who need the services, I'd know as a lawyer they weren't going to get them. And I'd be frank with them. I had people I sentenced as a judge. And when I said to him, you're on probation, and one of the conditions of your probation is that you participate in drug treatment. Now, he may hear that as a promise that I'm actually going to provide treatment. And that would be sweet. But it turns out that not really. The barriers to him getting into a program and sustaining himself in the program are much larger than a mere sentence or two from a judge is going to fix. Didn't I tell you to stop committing crimes? I had one guy I sent to prison 3 times for property crimes. And each time, okay, go to prison 16 months, not long sentences. Then a few years later, here he is again. All right, go to prison. And a few years later, here he is again. And so I sent him to prison again. And I'm like, you're a slow learner. But really, I was the slow learner. I mean, here I am doing exactly what didn't work 2 times before, and I'm acting like it's his fault, right, that I'm doing this. And that's not really a fair assessment of what's going on. I should know better. And I should have a path that I can say to him, here's how this is going to work. You're going to get hooked up with this guy, and he's going to bird dog you day and night until whatever the plan is. But the notion that just sending him to prison, I mean, we talk about what lessons people learn from being convicted. And we like to think that people's response to being convicted is, I will never do that again. I've learned my lesson. But they're just as likely to learn from the case that they should have had a better lawyer. That's the problem that got them into prison. It had nothing to do with them. It just had to do with the unluck of getting a bad lawyer. So no lesson is taught there that's going to change the guy's community behavior. And it's easy to assume what lessons we're teaching. But when you talk to people, it turns out that you're often completely wrong. I'll never commit another crime with my brother-in-law. Right? And you say, well, that wasn't the message. Your brother-in-law is an idiot, and I understand that it was his problem that got you arrested, not yours. Nonetheless, the lesson here is not about the brother-in-law. But you don't know what lessons people are taking from the experience. And they may not know at the moment. Downstream, they're processing what happened and they're blaming it on the judge or the DA or their lawyer or the brother-in-law who idiocy got them arrested. And they get left out of the equation entirely. It wasn't about me. I was just unlucky. And of course, since we know that for every crime that's committed, there are dozens that were similar but didn't result in arrest or conviction, you can see why people would have that thought about it. How come I didn't get away with like everybody else does? And that undermines the lesson that you think you're teaching.
Hence
So,
why penance does not work. They just
yeah,
sit in the cell by themselves and think about, I'm never doing anything with my brother-in-law again. So that's what people think about in the cell,
well, and you can, and it's not an unreasonable lesson.
right?
I mean,
He's
it's
off the
true.
team. Yes.
Uh, it's just not socially useful from the community's perspective.
Right. Right. Well, in the time that we have left, I'm wondering if there's anything else we want to talk about with particularly misdemeanors.
We could do a lot more for our communities if we use misdemeanor convictions a lot less. There's no doubt in my mind that most of the problems that are summed up by misdemeanor arrests could be solved better without a criminal prosecution. And we've taken various runs at that. The drug courts are one, the community courts that we had for a while are another. Diversions of all kinds address that as well. So there are a lot of mechanisms that are available that don't rely on the criminal justice system, but the will to engage in those is lacking. And partially it's because the policymakers and the legislators are like, the community is not going to be satisfied with a class or therapy, that they want consequences. That's what they want. Now, in my experience of talking to victims, if they're at all thoughtful, that's not what they want. They routinely will say, I just want to know that this won't happen again. That's the message that the victims consistently send to you. And then we have a tendency to say to them, well, then I'll throw his ass in jail. But that doesn't turn out to deliver on what they want. And that level of education, and part of this goes back to what your experiences were as a child. If we were all raised by parents who never engaged in physical discipline, I think the criminal justice system would look very different today than it does now, because that experience. I had a father stand up in my court and say, as I was sending his son to prison, that the whole problem is that children's services wouldn't let him discipline the kid. That some years before they had intervened and told him he could not discipline the kid in his typical manner, which used a belt, and that having been deprived of that tool, it now ended with his son going to prison. And as I said to him, that's not what it's about. But on the other hand, dad is saying, that's how my dad raised me. And that's what I did with my son, because that kind of strictness is what gets people to toe the line. Now, to say to dad, all that suffering you did at the hands of your father was wasted, and all the abuse you heaped on your son was wasted. It didn't deliver. It couldn't deliver. It wasn't the right thing to do. That's not an easy message to deliver or hear. We have a tendency to think, hey, whatever I went through is what made me into the fine, upstanding person I am today. But that isn't necessarily the case.
And then we know from the ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences studies, that the more of those factors like physical abuse or mental abuse, the more that a person has, the more likely they are to end up in the criminal justice system later on. So dad very much could have been significantly contributing to his son being in that courtroom.
And that whole analysis where we look at the childhood factors and project that into the future and see that correlation with adult problems, it gives the lie to intentional crime. These are not people making free choices to engage in criminal behavior. These are people who've been trained to engage in criminal behavior, inadvertently, perhaps, but nonetheless, they've been put through experiences that increase the likelihood of criminal behavior rather than reduce it. And you and I and the other people in the system see it over and over again. I want to say, hey, let's just go back and start your life over again.
Yeah.
Give you a couple of thoughtful, non-addicted parents, and let's see how that works out.
Yeah. Any last thoughts for our listeners?
The motivations of the system are as complex as the motivations of the defendants.
So when we're talking about this whole intersection of behavioral health and criminal justice, and particularly aid and assist, I'll say, as Judge Jones told me once, there's lots of really smart people that have been working on this problem. And if it was easy to solve, we would have solved it a long time ago.
Yeah. You always meet people who are new to these problems, and they're always like, let's just get this solved. And you say, listen, people smarter than you have gone to their deathbed not having figured this out.
Exactly.
And part of it is the sort of implicit disrespect of people who work on these problems.
Yeah.
Which is, geez, they haven't fixed this.
Yeah.
And you got to appreciate how complicated this is. And that really smart, hardworking people have devoted their lives to solving these problems. And it's not like we're in the same place we were 10 years ago or 30 years ago. We have learned some things and we do better at some things. But the size of the problems are gigantic. I just read somewhere is that you have to think that Sisyphus liked rolling that rock. And that's going to roll that rock up the hill every day, and every night it's going to roll back down, and the next morning you're going to push it back up the hill again. And every morning it's going to be back at the bottom, and that's what we do.
I feel seen, Judge Jones. I feel seen.
All right. Hey, it's been fun talking.
It has been. It's been a joy. The Center Collaborative is a production of the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, a specialized division of Greater Oregon Behavioral Health Incorporated. It is produced by me, Chris Thomas, with production assistance from Patrick Kennedy. Music by Patrick Mulvihill and Patrick Kennedy. Subscribe to the Center Perspective using your favorite app. To learn more about criminal justice and behavioral health in Oregon, visit the Center's website at ocbhji.org. You can also find us on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us. Join us next time as we chat with the experts about programs and partnerships at work within this complex and yet compelling field.